Hello, this is the backup video to Ancient History on Wednesday, the 23rd of September 2020. Where we left things, you had been introduced to some of the details of the final solution to the Jewish question. In the aftermath of World War II, there are real efforts to make sure that what happened was documented, because it's the sort of thing that is so easily dismissed as embellishment or propaganda. Yes, you do have it. Or propaganda or something like that. In other words, lies, anti-German lies. Well, it's not. And so extensive effort is made to film, and since then, extensive effort has been made to take the testimony of survivors who have lived through these horrific events so that we can learn from them, so that the words never again will actually mean something. Zoe.
I was going to say, my family, we have a book of my great-grandmother's life around the time when World War II had happened. And it goes all the way from there to when she ended up in America. And it's a book that we have to sort of like read over some of the events that happened during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that she had to do at one point was be a translator. And I remember one specific story that my grandmother told me, that sometime when she was still during World War II, she had an orphanage, I believe, that was set up for a whole ton of little Jewish kids who had been orphaned during the war.
Mm-hmm.
And the Nazis came in and invaded the place and killed every single child there and beat her to leave her for dead. And
the SS would certainly do that. Your grandmother's lucky to be alive.
Great-grandmother.
Great-grandmother. Or she was lucky to have lived through that. This happened to real people. And one of the things about the final solution that took me decades to really figure out, it wasn't until I was at a week-long conference with a group of survivors, it isn't just the people who survived and the numbers of dead. It's the number of people who would never be born. The number of people who would never grow up. We could have had somebody who discovered a cure for cancer or a practical space engine. We could have had somebody who figured out how to do flying cars both safely and wonderfully. We could have had the next Rembrandt or the next Michelangelo or the next Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan. But they're dead. All killed because, or never born, because 6 million or so Jews were exterminated simply because they were Jews. Now, it wasn't just Jews that were in the concentration camps or the death camps, but they were the primary targets. Other groups included gypsies. Gypsies were wiped out as much as Jews were. The attempt was made. Gypsies were harder to find because they moved around being gypsies. Today they're called Roma. But they were targeted. Homosexuals were targeted. For obvious reasons. They didn't fit into the Nazi order. Jehovah's Witnesses were targeted. Devout Christians of Catholic and Protestant types, denominations were targeted. Patriotic Germans were targeted, who simply were more old style and less oriented to the Nazi order. Anyone who didn't fit in, including a bunch of other racial and behavioral minorities. But the Jews were the primary target. They were targeted for extermination, so that European Jewry would end, so that the genocide would be completed. And it's this fact which echoes through the world in the late 40s. Now, up until World War I, the Holy Land was under Turkish rule. It had been under the Ottoman Turks for about 500 years. It was a sleepy area. And in the late 1800s, Jews began to, in small numbers, buy land in Palestine and settle there. building the first kibbutz farms. In World War I, the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, took the side of Germany. And so many Jews from that part of the world joined up with the Ottoman forces and fought the British and French. Jews fought on all sides of the war. But because the Turks were fighting the British and the British were in Egypt, Palestine became a main battleground in 1917. As British armies, with Lawrence of Arabia, who was a real person, are heading towards Jerusalem and east of Jerusalem, Chaim Weizmann, the head of the International Jewish Organization, an organization that was trying to set up a Jewish homeland in Palestine, together with former British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, come up with a declaration by the British government called the Balfour Declaration. And what the Balfour Declaration of 1917 says, that if Britain wins the war, a Jewish homeland will be established in Palestine. This is the first time in 1813 years, or so, and high 1700s, first time in almost 1800 years that a great empire has said that Jews can return to their homeland. Why did the British do this? Why was the Balfour Declaration promulgated? The answer is, the expectation is that Jews around the world are going to love this, and they're going to send money to help the British war effort, because the British had bankrupted their empire fighting the Kaiser's Germany. So the British, in order to stay in the fight, needed money. They thought the Jews from America and from around the world would have that money, and so they say, we'll set up a Jewish homeland in Palestine after the war. So Jerusalem's conquered, the Allies win the war, and Jerusalem and all of Judea, all of Palestine, is given to Britain to rule as a colonial territory. So now Britain is faced with having to rule these people. And the problem is, the Arabs, the Muslims who live there, are afraid that these foreigner Jews are going to come to their country and take it over. And the Jews are afraid that the British are going to backtrack. And the British waffle. They try to please both sides and end up infuriating both. So between World War I and World War II, in the early 1900s, terrorist organizations are set up by the Arabs under the auspices of their chief priest, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. Don't worry about the name, I'm just telling it to you because it's true. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, is the leading Islamist cleric in all of that region. And he classifies the Jews as enemy invader aliens who need to be destroyed. This invasion needs to stop. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, ends up becoming a personal friend of Adolf Hitler. During World War II, he raises a division of Muslims to fight for Hitler and Germany. And he and Hitler conspire together on the extermination of the Jews because they both agree on that. They both want the Jewish people wiped out. The Jews, on the other hand, are not happy that the British are reducing the numbers of Jews that can move to Palestine. And so they begin smuggling them in. And the British crack down on them. So several British Jewish terrorist organizations are set up. The biggest is known as Haganah. And the Haganah is sort of a group of people that are fighting an irregular guerrilla war, a terror war, against the British authorities to sneak more Jews into Palestine. The Irgun is a much more extreme terror group, and they believe in fighting the British and kicking them out of Judea so that there can be an independent Israel. They also fight the Arab terror groups. So suddenly Palestine becomes a very difficult place to rule, just like Judea was in Roman times, because of all these terror groups. And the British are hated by all of them. Yes?
How do you spell the name of the terror groups?
You don't need to remember, but if you're curious, Haganah is Haggah, N-A-H. Haganah. I think it's H-A-G-G-A-N-A-H. If you find out different, you can laugh at it. Irgun is I-R-G-U-N. Irgun. Thank you for asking. So, World War II starts. And the Germans have an army in Libya that they want to break through to Egypt. And if they march into Judea, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem is going to call on the Arabs to rise up in jihad against the British Empire. The British stop the Germans here at El Alamein, but they come so close to marching into Egypt and into Palestine and having the general uprising of the Arabs. After World War II, Britain's exhausted. It's spent its wealth on 2 world wars, fighting the German Emperor and then Hitler. Its people are tired, war-weary. Its empire is on the verge of falling apart. And their great ally, the United States, is undermining the British Empire every chance we get. Because we don't like the British Empire, see, because we used to be colonials. It was not a... Talk more about that some other time, whether it was a good idea. But the British Empire is beginning to disintegrate. So, they say to the new United Nations organization, we're leaving Palestine. We are washing our hands of it. In 1947, we're telling you, and in 1948, we're walking out. We're done. We're sick of being shot at, bombed, hated, bayoneted by everyone. We're done. United Nations, hot potato. It's your problem. So the United Nations catches the hot potato and is trying to bounce it around without dropping it. First thing that has to happen is in 1947, the United Nations has to agree to a plan to split Palestine into an Arab Islamic section and a Jewish section. It is one of the few times after World War II when the United States and the Soviet Union both vote yes to establish the State of Israel. So the United Nations agrees that Palestine will be divided up, and that in 1948, when the British leave, that the Jews will, for the first time in 1813 or 14 years, have a homeland of their own in Palestine, in Judea. When the British march out on Independence Day for the State of Israel, 5 Arab armies invade from all directions. From Egypt, from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon, 5 armies. With one goal, to drive the Jews into the sea. This is a war of conquest and of extermination. The Arabs have tanks and artillery. They have a British general working with them, because the British don't want to offend the Arabs. They have fighters and bombers. The Israelis start out with machine pistols and hand grenades. But after 3 years of struggle, Israel wins. They get planes, they get tanks, they get guns, and they outfight the Arabs again and again and again. So the War of Independence is the first of the so-called Arab-Israeli wars. And the Arabs are furious. They're supposed to be great warriors. But a tiny little country, maybe the size of Rhode Island at that point, or Connecticut, or Delaware, has defeated them. So they're not going to make peace. Now, during this fight, local Arabs are encouraged by the Jews, by the Israelis, to stay. But the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, says, leave, join the armies, and when we conquer, you'll get your lands back. Well, they don't conquer. So the Palestinian Arabs who leave, what are they going to do now that their homeland is in the hand of the Israelis? Their land is now confiscated because they chose to fight Israel rather than join it. Because the Israelis understood that they needed Arabs as well as Jews to make it work. This is the beginning of the Palestinian problem. Those Palestinians who chose to leave and fight against Israel have nowhere to go. And the other Arab countries, since 1950 and 51, have not been willing to take them in, except as refugees in isolated refugee camps, stinking, disease-ridden, crime-ridden refugee camps. So the Palestinians become this running sore in the Middle East that's still a problem, because their fellow Arabs won't accept them as fellow Arabs. See, at the beginning of this process, culturally, there's not much difference between Palestinian Arabs and Syrian Arabs and Jordanian Arabs. But with this experience in the camps, the Palestinians become uniquely militant and mobilized and anti-Israel, and they're also coarsened by the crime and crowding and death in these refugee camps. And it's the fault of their fellow Muslims. There are a lot of people who are pro-Palestinian who say that these Arabs should have a right to return. The right of return is what it's called. What Israel says is, look, we don't have much land to begin with. Every Arab who sided with us has kept their lands. Some of them have gotten much richer. But for those Arabs who chose to leave and fight us, they made their choice. They're gone. We're not letting them back. And so this is one of the contentions between the two states. There's peace for a few years. But in 1956, an Arab nationalist takes over the Suez Canal, the most important waterway on Earth, which connects the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The most important waterway on Earth, right here. The Egyptians take it over from the British and French, who had built it and who had been running it. The British and French decide they're going to take it back. Israel's going to help. However, the British and French don't inform their American ally. In 1956, when the British and French take over the Suez Canal, it's less than a week before an American election. President Eisenhower, who's running for re-election, was not consulted. He's furious, personally angry. And he says to the American allies, Britain, France, and Israel, if you don't immediately withdraw your troops, I'm going to immediately withdraw American financial aid to your economies. I'll pull my troops out of your countries. You'll be on your own. And in 1956, the economies and the societies in Britain, France, and Israel were completely dependent upon American support and American aid. So they pulled back, humiliated. But the Israelis, again, had triumphed over a numerically superior Egyptian army. That's the second Arab-Israeli war, the Suez Crisis. Now we go 11 years later. The Arabs are building up their strength again. They want to march into Israel and drive the Jews into the sea. The Jews decide, you know what? Why wait for them to attack? We're going to attack them. We're going to do a preventive attack on the enemy that's about to attack us. So in June of 1967, the Israeli Air Force launches sneak attacks on all of the Arab air forces in Egypt and Jordan and Syria, in Lebanon, and in Iraq, even as far as Iraq, and destroys most of them on the ground. The Israeli armies then conquer the rest of what's now Israel. They conquer parts of Syria, and they conquer a vast part of Egypt called the Sinai Peninsula. In fact, they conquer an area right up to the eastern shore of the Suez Canal. So Israel doubles or triples in size. In 1967, during this sneak attack war, the Israelis also take the whole city of Jerusalem. The Arabs are deep, they're apoplectic. They're, because there's nothing that they seem to be able to do right against these Jews. These Jews just, so they're being driven mad. Now we approach a critical moment. Between 1967 and 1973, the Soviet Union, our communist enemies from Russia, rearm all of the Arab armies. They equip their air forces with new planes, and they equip the Arabs with huge numbers of anti-aircraft missiles. Huge numbers. These are like telephone poles that launch and can hit a fighter plane and have a warhead that can destroy it. One shot, one kill. The plan is to attack Israel on the high holy day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, one of the holiest days in the Jewish calendar. The Jews are going to be home with their families. The army is going to be thinned out because so many soldiers are home on leave. And if we can pull it off, we'll launch a surprise attack against Israel and win. For the only time in the history of the Arab-Israeli wars, Egypt wins. Egypt launches a surprise attack across the Suez Canal. They break through the Israeli mound of dirt called a berm with fire hoses with water from the canal. They bridge the canal, and within a day they have tanks 20, 30, 40 miles east of the canal. Of course, what the Israelis do is predictable. They call up their troops and they send in their air force. And it's like a sky full of stars, and every star an exploding Israeli aircraft. The missiles and the guns are the policy of the Soviet Union at that time and the Arabs of that time. If it flies, it dies. About a fifth of the Israeli Air Force is destroyed in less than an afternoon. So now the Israelis are losing to Egypt in the west. Their Air Force is mauled and brutalized. And in the north, the Syrians are coming across the Golan Heights, and it's going to be like a pincer attack. The Egyptians will come in from the south, the Syrians from the north, and Israel will be destroyed. Here's a secret. Shh! Don't tell anyone. But in 1973, Israel has nuclear weapons. It's a secret nuclear program. And Israel has at least a few atom bombs. I don't know if they had any hydrogen bombs then. They certainly had several atom bombs. And as the Israelis become desperate, afraid that a later Holocaust is about to happen, the Israelis begin preparing their nuclear weapons for use. Had the Israelis nuked Cairo, Egypt, or Damascus, Syria, the Arab capitals, the Arabs would have gone mad and they would have begged the Russians to nuke Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, the Israeli cities. If the Russians had nuked Israel, we, allies of the Israelis, would have probably nuked parts of Russia, and we could have been looking at World War III, total thermonuclear war, and the end of all life on Earth. That's how close we were. President Richard Nixon sets up an airlift to stop this. He promises the Israelis all the weapons they'll need. He promises them American satellite data to pinpoint where the Egyptian armies are. He promises to replace the planes that Israel has lost, the tanks, the guns. He promises medical supplies, financial support, whatever it takes. And that airlift saves Israel. At that moment, we become the main enemy, and the war on terror begins for many of our Arab opponents. We did it because Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is our natural ally. Many Israelis are former American Jews. And we did it because Americans tend to dislike bullies. The Arabs were acting like bullies. Simplistic, but there's truth in that. With the airlift, the Israelis win the war. The UN comes in and establishes ceasefire, and the 73 Yom Kippur War is over. But what our Arab and Islamist enemies have learned is that we will never get rid, we being they, will never get rid of the little Satan, which is Israel, so long as the great Satan, which is the United States, remains a powerful force in the world. So we become the primary target. Now, the Arabs had begun striking out at the West even a little bit before this, because a year earlier, in 1972, during the Munich Winter Olympics, the first Olympics in Germany since Hitler's time, a group of Palestinian terrorists took prisoner the entire Israeli Olympic team, held them for a while, and then killed them all. So that massacre at the Munich Olympics was a sign of things to come. But after the Israeli victory in the Yom Kippur War, this victory caused by American support, the first thing the Arabs did was economic. In 1973, we were dependent upon Arab oil for our economy. Our gas came from there, our oil came from there, heating oil and oil for industrial purposes. The Arab countries controlled a new organization called OPEC. OPEC is the consortium of all the oil-producing countries. It's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. and it's run by the Arabs in 1973. And what they do is they say, we're not selling oil to U.S. We're not selling oil to U.S. You get it? We're not selling oil to the United States anymore. They embargo our oil. Suddenly, the oil-thirsty American economy has no oil coming in. This is a serious problem. Suddenly, we have the Nixon administration and later the Ford administration restricting the amount, rationing gas. So suddenly, instead of being able to fill your tank up, you can only get $5 worth of gas, and you've got to at a time, and you've got to wait in line, usually 3-4 hours, just to get that $5 worth of gas. But you can't buy gas every day. You can only buy gas every other day. If you have an odd-numbered license plate, you go on these days. If you have an even-numbered license plate, you go on those days. Now, the oil embargo transforms America. One of the things it does is it causes massive inflation. Before the oil embargo, a typical paperback book was less than $1. By the second oil embargo in 1979, the typical paperback book was $5.99. So the price of a book, same product, has gone up about 500% in just a few years. Before the oil embargo, a husband could reliably support his family with a decent living standard on one income. After the oil embargo, you needed a lot more wives to enter the workforce for the family to maintain their lifestyle. So the Arab oil embargo is a big deal in terms of getting women out of the home and into the workforce, for better or worse. This really hurts the American economy because everything is shipped by truck, and trucks depend upon gas and oil. Eventually, they stopped the oil embargo in '74, but the Arabs are still cold to us. A few years later, in 1978, President Carter, liberal Democrat, guy I don't normally like very much, did a wonderful thing. The president of Egypt, President Sadat, after the Yom Kippur War, began making peace overtures to the Jews in Israel. His brother had been killed in the fighting. He had had a change of heart. He wanted peace. The Jews were led by the former leader of the Irgun terror group, Menachem Begin. And at first, he doesn't trust Sadat. He doesn't trust any Arab. But after a few years of talking, they end up at a place called Camp David in the forested mountains north of Washington, D.C., a presidential hideaway. And the President of the United States and the President of Egypt and the Prime Minister of Israel work out a peace treaty. Up until this year, it was the only peace treaty between an Arab country and Israel. Up until 2020, there were no other Arab countries willing to make peace with Israel. But Egypt in 1978 signs the Camp David Accords. Israel signs the Camp David Accords, and there's peace. Here's the basis of the peace. Israel has to give back Sinai. It has to give back this territory east of the canal. It does so. It gives land in return for peace. For a tiny little country like them, that's a heavy price, but they're willing to pay it. And since 1978, the Egyptian government, which is run by the army, the Egyptian army, is the only group within the Islamic world to, in good faith, not only make peace with Israel, but keep the peace with Israel. Again and again, there's temptations. The other Arabs try to get the Egyptian army into the fight, because without the Egyptian army, they'll never win an open war. They need the Egyptians. But the Egyptians say, no, we've made peace. Sadat himself pays the price, though, for this. In 1980, just 2 years after the Camp David Accords, Sadat is reviewing his troops on a parade stand. His own bodyguards riddle him with holes from their machine pistols. So he is killed for making peace with the Jews. But his successor, President Mubarak, keeps the peace. And the successor to President Mubarak that runs Egypt today has kept the peace. Egypt is amazing in that it is the only Arab country willing to make peace with the Jews until just a few months ago. Why won't the Arabs make peace with the Jews? Why is there war after war after war before and after this between the other Arabs, non-Egyptian Arabs, and the Jews? The answer has to do with the Crusades. Remember, the Crusades came to the Middle East, and at first the Crusader Knights seemed really scary, but after 100 years or so, the superior numbers of Arabs just kicked them out. Bye-bye, gone. No more Crusader Knights. Most Arabs believe Inshallah. Inshallah is Arabic for God willing. They believe Inshallah, God willing, God will provide victory for the Arab armies against the Jews sooner or later. It's not about calculating the risk. It's not about being reasonable. It's about being faithful. It's the same lesson of the Maccabees. It's the same lesson of Masada. It is the lesson of being faithful regardless of all.
I was gonna say it's like the thing that you told us about the Maccabees of how if God's with us, who can stand against us.
Exactly. And that is what many Arabs still believe. So with the exception of the Egyptian army, again, up until a couple of months ago, no Arab government was willing to take the risk of making peace with the Jews because they're probably going to get assassinated by Islamist terrorists. Because they'll probably be called by fundamentalist Muslims traitors to their faith and to their God and to the Prophet Muhammad. So this is a complication. But still, Egypt makes peace with Israel, and it's a wonderful moment. 1978, the Camp David Accords. A year later, actually that same year though, the Shah of Iran, who tried to modernize and westernize Iran, is overthrown. In 1979, Samarov, he ends up coming to the United States to get cancer treatment. The government of Iran that had overthrown him is a fundamentalist Islamist government. There's still the government of Iran, run by a group of Islamic priests called the Mullahs. It's the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they say, because we took the Shah in to give him cancer treatments, this provoked them to do what they're about to do. Students, Iranian students, shouting, "Death to America, the great Satan! Death to America, the great Satan!" surround the U.S. Embassy in the capital of Iran, the city of Tehran, in the autumn of 1979. And then they break in. The Marine Guards are overpowered. The embassy staff is captured and held hostage. The Iranian government says, well, we don't like you Americans anyway, and we're not going to attack our students. Our students are our future. What do you want? So the Iranian government does not help us recapture our people. For 444 days, including the entire 1980 presidential election, the Iranians hold hundreds of American hostages. They eventually reduce the number to, I think, 55 or 60. They get rid of pregnant women, they get rid of children, but they keep the men. President Carter tries diplomacy. For 6 months, the Iranians make us look like fools and idiots. And basically, in front of the world, they're saying, oh, America is a false power. They're so strong, and yet we're holding on to their hostages. We've got them. Finally, in the late spring of 1980, as the election is heating up, President Carter decides he's going to send in a military force to rescue the hostages. But President Carter has systematically defunded the military for the last 3 years. And so the military is not really up for a lot of operational work. A target is picked in the Iranian desert south of where the hostages are to be a landing place and a refueling point. Our planes and choppers would go in, they'd refuel, then they'd go on to Tehran, they'd get the hostages, they'd bring them out, they'd refuel, and they'd leave. And this is supposed to be in the middle of nowhere. When our guys land and set up the fuel depot, an Iranian tour bus drives by on a major highway. This tour bus is stopped by our troops, and the people on the bus are held, and they watch American planes and helicopters come in and begin to refuel. The fact that they put this right next to a major highway is kind of a mistake. It's a kind of a big mistake. And then, as our planes and helicopters are taking off for the final leg to go get the hostages, there's a midair collision between two of them. The fireball can be seen for hundreds of miles. The mission's blown. Our people pull out. The wreckage is filmed the next day by Iranian television. Their militias are dancing on the ruins of the American aircraft, and the tour bus people tell the stories of how they watched the American Tiger fall apart. The hostages are held for the rest of Carter's presidency. Carter loses the presidency to Ronald Reagan, my favorite president, in large part because he seems weak and incapable of dealing with the Iranians. So the Iran hostage crisis changes American politics. On the day that Reagan is inaugurated president in January of 1981, the hostages are flown out as he takes the oath of office. Now, Reagan had a different attitude. Reagan said, quote, "These savages are going to be brought back to the Stone Age. We will not stop until we get our people back or punish the evildoers who took them." Reagan uses terms like evildoers, barbarians, savages, and war. For whatever reason, the Iranians decide they don't want to mess with him, and they give the hostages up. And for most Americans, oh, our hostages are home, it's over. But the people who captured the hostages are still in power. In fact, one of the students who personally was involved later becomes the president of Iran, a guy named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. He was president of Iran about 15, 20 years ago. A guy who personally led Americans around on rope leashes, bound and gagged. Iran's president. So for them, this is all part of the anti-American jihad, because while America's around, Israel will remain. A few years pass. Oh, something else happens in 1979. I can't believe I didn't put an arrow, but I'm gonna. Okay. In 1979, the Soviet Union is uncomfortable with the government in Afghanistan on its southern border. Afghanistan had been a stable kingdom, but in the 60s and 70s it had been taken over by a group of pro-Soviet socialists. But the pro-Soviet government was showing signs of weakness and dithering. The Russians were afraid that Afghanistan might become an American ally on its southern border, and in the Cold War that was not going to be tolerated. So in the autumn of 1979, at about the same time that the hostages are taken, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. They invade with massive tank armies, World War II style. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and tanks. For 10 years, the Soviets are in Afghanistan trying to control the place. And for us, it's an opportunity to pay them back for Vietnam. See, in Vietnam, Americans were fighting in a jungle trying to preserve the freedom of South Vietnam against communist aggression. But Soviets were supplying the communists with anti-aircraft missiles, with rifles, with weapons, with supplies, and they were also protecting North Vietnam from invasion. So 50,000 plus Americans are killed, many more are wounded and maimed in the Vietnam War, which lasts about 10 years. They bled us white, 65 to 75. Well, now they're in Afghanistan. We get to do the same thing to them. We make allies with a group of Islamic holy warriors called the Mujahideen, the Holy Warriors of God. And we give them weapons. And we give them anti-aircraft missiles called Stingers. And we give them intelligence as to how to fight the Soviets. And we send CIA operatives in. And we kill over 50,000 Russians with the Afghanis. And in 1989, after 10 years of fighting, the Soviets pull out in defeat. What they did to us in Vietnam, we paid them back for in Afghanistan. And in doing so, we made allies with many jihadis. The enemy in their war was the Soviet Union, not the United States. That was about to change. The people we had armed and supplied in the 80s fighting the Soviets were going to take issue with something that was about to happen. Let's see time. Okay, I'll do this last bit. Throughout the 1980s, there's an inter-Muslim war, the Iran-Iraq War. Chemical weapons are used for the first time since World War I. The Iranians and the Iraqis use mustard gas. My wife used to work with a Kurdish woman who escaped from Iranian Kurdistan. Her village was taken by Saddam Hussein's Iraqi Fedayeen, Saddam, his elite forces. She watched her brother get killed being shot through the head as a pacification measure. The Iraqis came in and they basically rounded up all the men and they shot them in front of the women and children. She was gassed by her own Iranian government with mustard gas and still has reduced lung function to this day. Actually, I think it was chlorine gas. Yeah, it must have been chlorine gas because she survived. But she still has scarring and she still has reduced lung function. The Iran-Iraq War was a brutal war between Muslims of different denominations, and between races. The Persians are not Arabs. The Iraqi Arabs are not Persians. But now we come to the last thing I'm going to talk about today. In 1990, the Iraqi government, under the Arab socialist Saddam Hussein, decides that it needs more oil. And south of Iraq is an little bitty country called Kuwait. And Kuwait is the size of a city-state. Iraq is a real country. Kuwait was neutral in the Iran-Iraq War, except it supported the Iraqis indirectly with money and weapon sales. But that didn't matter. Kuwait is sitting on one of the biggest oil reserves in the world. And Saddam Hussein, ruler of Iraq, wants that oil. Well, he couldn't beat the Iranians, but he can certainly beat the Kuwaitis. So in autumn of 1990, Iraqi forces conquer Kuwait. The American president, George Herbert Walker Bush, says this will not stand. This is aggression like Hitler. We're going to stop it, and sends American troops to Saudi Arabia. Kuwait is here, near the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia is to the south. Iraq is right here. So we send troops to eastern Saudi Arabia, including females who can drive. Females who are sometimes in command of males. Females who weren't dressed in hijabs or burqas. American soldiers with their rock and roll and their Christianity and their Judaism and their atheism and their agnosticism. American troops, infidels on Arabian soil. The same country that has the holy city of Mecca. This drives one of the people we helped in Afghanistan to action. This guy's name is, he's an Arab sheik named Osama bin Laden. And he founds a new terror group called the Base, which in Arabic is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda means the base, like the base of a building, the foundation, the base. Al-Qaeda is set up to fight the Great Satan, the United States, because it had the nerve to send troops to Saudi Arabia. So they're percolating on the back burner. Meanwhile, our troops hold the Iraqis, and then we drive them out of Kuwait in the Persian Gulf War of 1991. The Iraqis suffer over 100,000 dead. We suffer less than 300. Why? Because the American military was operating with the highest technology army in the world. The Iraqis were using Soviet equipment of the 1960s era. 100,000 enemy dead to less than 300 American dead. This is the beginning, by the way, of Americans thinking that they are entitled to fight wars without taking casualties. It's almost like a video game war. In fact, there are briefings where the general in command of American forces shows buildings with crosshairs on them. And the crosshairs in the camera is on a guided bomb targeted by laser that hits the corner of a building or the center of a bridge. There was one event where an Iraqi guy was running and the bomb was coming down, and the general called him the luckiest guy in Iraq because he dived and avoided the explosion and survived. It seemed like a video game war, and we took so few casualties. So America was pretty happy. Al-Qaeda was not. And I think I'm going to leave it there. From that moment, we are in the age of the modern war on terror. And I will continue next time with Somalia. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Yeah.
So because America was so convinced they couldn't take casualties because of the First Order, that means that later on, the ego of America itself kind of gets a little bigger, and people get way too confident.
In some respects, and you're talking to someone that is absolutely pro-war in regards to the war on terror. I think we should have conquered Iran in 2006, personally. Not many people agree with me, but I do. I've supported the war in Afghanistan. The war, I still do. I support the war in the 1991 Gulf War. But I understand there will be casualties, there will be suffering, there will be death. War is horrible, but sometimes surrender is worse. But a lot of Americans get the idea that war can be high-tech and easy, that we can substitute air attacks for ground troops. Air attacks can bomb really well, but you need troops to hold the ground, and troops always take casualties. So yes, I do think that a lot of Americans began to develop an unrealistic picture of how easy war can be in the modern era. We haven't fought a real war since 1945. In Korea and Vietnam, we had every advantage. We still took casualties, but it wasn't that bad. But we weren't fighting for our lives since World War II. And if we are, God forbid, in a situation like that within my lifetime or your lifetime, you will see how different it feels and how different it is.
It's probably terrifying knowing that you die.
Oh gosh, yes. But it's also terrifying to think it's possible the enemy could win and your entire way of life could be destroyed, your family could be enslaved. There's a whole bunch of stuff at work. No, it really is an amazingly scary thing. Did you have your hand up?
I was just gonna say my dad was in Kuwait during this field.
God bless him. My brother-in-law was too. Did your dad say anything in particular that you'd like to pass on?
He told me a lot about what he did there and
it was
it's important.
Good. It was rocky. And after Saddam Hussein lost, on his way out, he set all the oil wells on fire. So for up to 6 months in some places, the air was black with oil smoke, with hundreds and hundreds of oil fires. It was an act of spite. And your dad, if he was there, he experienced that. Some tough stuff. Anything else? Remember, I love it when you guys have questions and comments. I love to talk about things. And when we have time, it would be great for you guys to ask questions or to offer alternative opinions. I do not expect you to sit there silently all the time. I'm looking for, when we have time, real conversation. Yes?
I actually am curious. Why are you pro war on terrorism?
Because I believe it's a life and death struggle. 100 years ago, just over, we fought the Kaiser's Germany. And we won with the help of Britain and France. 80 years ago, we fought Hitler's Germany. And we won with the help of Britain and Russia. Then we fought a long twilight struggle with Russia for 40 years, known as the Cold War. In that, we fought in Korea and Vietnam. We won. Then there was a brief period of peace, and now we're involved in the war on terror. However, I've always believed that sooner or later we and China are going to square off. And we're close to that. Closer than I'd like, closer than a lot of sane people would like. If we fail to conclude the war on terror before we're finished, before we deal with the Chinese, and before they try to deal with us, we're going to be fighting two wars at the same time. And that is difficult. For my purpose, I do believe, and we'll talk about this next week, I do believe that the war on terror is a necessary fight because I think there are consequences to losing. And one of those consequences is if we do end up in a global struggle with China, we're going to have to watch our backs because many in the Arab world will still be trying to stab it. Does that make sense? You don't have to agree, but you asked, and I gave you one of my reasons. There are more.
That makes sense.
We'll talk more, but I don't want to steal our thunder from next week. Here's the plan. I intend to conclude these lectures tomorrow. Friday, I'm going to have you watch the Obsession movie at home. I'll give you links to that. Next Monday, you should expect not only to take a quiz on Baker Chapter 2, which you're going to turn in, but also you should have your essays done, and there probably will also be a quiz, not just about Baker Chapter 2, but about everything we've covered in the background to the war on terror. That quiz will either be Monday or Tuesday of next week. So there's a lot coming up on Monday. After that, we'll do the creation myths during the middle of next week. and then we'll move on to other ancient history items. But that's the plan. Thank you for your attention, and yeah.
Oh, no, I was just curious because you said that Reagan was your favorite president. Who was your least favorite president?
You really don't want me to say. I'll tell Woodrow Wilson,
Okay.
president during World War I. And it's not because he was involved with World War I. He did a lot of stuff that I personally don't agree with. But if you are a progressive or a liberal Democrat, Wilson's sort of a hero because he did so many progressive things. You asked, I told. Do you have a favorite president?
No. I've
Okay.
only lived through 3, and one I don't even remember.
You don't remember Bush?
Nope, not
Okay.
at all.
Okay. So you have Obama and Trump.
Yep.
That's a strange perspective, and I'm sure you all have it. Yeah.
My favorite president is definitely Reagan.
Hoorah. Can I ask why?
Well, he did so much to help. Like, he had a strong stance on everything that's important to me personally.
I agree. That's why I like him. He stood up to the Russians, stood up to the communists. If anyone wants to talk about how great Obama is or how wonderful, you can talk next time. See you guys. Yes.
I would like to ask if possibly on Friday, if maybe you wanted to try and think, because I watched the video you made last Friday and I think camera quality was really good. However, maybe you could think about maybe doing Google Meet with summer classes because physically getting to talk to them about it, like not just video where you can physically interact with them, whatnot, that might be.
I see your point, and I thought about this. My attitude is I'll do that in person. I'd rather not do that on Friday. On Friday, I'd rather just do a one-way production because it's more straightforward. I don't feel as in command of the conversational space as I do as if I was in person. So that's really why.
Okay.
But anyway, thank you for your comments today and for your participation. And thank you at home